Awesome. Fantastic. Here we are. Hi, folks. If you're here for our event with Liana Finck and Andy Ward, you are in the right place. We're going to get started in just a moment. Oh, it's so exciting to see all the participant numbers tick up as folks come in. It's like opening a door. It's very exciting to me. All right. Here we are. Fantastic. Great. Hi, folks. Thanks for joining us for our event with Liana Finck, celebrating her latest book, Let There Be Light, the real story of her creation. So unfortunately, Lucas Adams, who was set to join us this evening, could not make it this evening. But fortunately, the great Andy Ward has stepped in to join us here tonight, and we're going to have a great time together with Liana and Andy. I'm Cara Johnson. I'm the events coordinator for Green Apple Books here in San Francisco, and we are delighted to be hosting this launch event this evening for Let There Be Light. It's the on sale date. It's very exciting. I have a couple of brief announcements for you folks before we get started. First, if you like book events, which I assume you do, at least to some degree, because you're here with us this evening, I would highly recommend that you check out Green Apple Books' full event calendar. I'll be brief in giving you a couple of highlights. This season, we have Miyako Kawakami with Ruth Ozeki joining us, Hernan Diaz, Otessa Moshfegh, and Lydia Yuknovich, and a bunch of other incredible authors. So if you are interested, please do check out our full event calendar on our website, which I will link to in the chat. All of our events are free unless stated otherwise. So that being said, if you can, please do buy books. Please do buy books from us if you are able to, an independent bookstore. I can think of at least one book that you can purchase this evening, Let There Be Light, and I will link to that in the chat as well. But we also know that it's hard to purchase every book that we want, but if you are able, we humbly request that you purchase a book from us. We're going to have a Q&A at the end of this evening. So if at any point you have a question, you can enter that into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. It might also be on the side of your screen, depending on your interface, but it just says Q&A with a couple of speech bubbles, and we'll get to as many questions as we can by the end of the hour. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce the two fabulous people joining us this evening. First, our author, Liana Finck, is the author of Passing for Human and Excuse Me, and is a regular contributor to The New Yorker. She's a recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship, a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship, and many other accolades. She has had artist residencies with McDowell, the Lower Manhattan Cultural Center, Headland Center for the Arts, and Willapa Bay. Her book, Let There Be Light, is the reason we are here this evening. I'd also like to introduce Andy Ward, who is the publisher of Random House, as well as Liana's editor. And I'm going to let Andy take it away. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Cara. That's my dog barking. And I'm sorry that I'm not Lucas Adams, but I am very, very, very happy to be here with one of my favorite people and authors on the planet, Liana Finck. Thank you for everybody. Thank you to everybody for being here with us tonight, and to Green Apple Books for setting this up. But Liana, thank you for taking the time to talk to us tonight about your new book, which I have here right next to me, and I just keep looking at because it's so beautiful. Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's really nice to see you. Yeah, there we go.
Oh, good to see you. Yeah, I'm really excited to get to talk to you very suddenly.
I always love talking to you, but particularly about this book that's, as of today, out in the world. I wanted to start with sort of the beginning of this journey, which I think is a kind of a fun way into this project. This came out of the first book that we did together, called Passing for Human. Had some sort of biblical interludes. It was sort of a memoir, a graphic memoir that had these little brief interludes woven into it that featured a female god. And those were some of my favorite parts of the book. And I remember talking to you about that after we had finished that book, and we started thinking about, well, what would happen if we took that and did more with it, and what if we actually thought about a graphic retelling of the Old Testament, or the book of Genesis. And I think what we ended up with is something very different than a retelling. I think it's more of a reimagining. And I'm wondering if you could just start there and talk, and let's talk a little bit about, how this idea evolved for you, and how what we ended up with is really very different than I think what we thought we were going to have when we began this journey.
Yeah. Passing for Human was kind of a mishmash of a lot of different things that I had made over the course of a number of years. It was, the premise of the book is that it kept starting over. And actually I had kept starting over. And one of my ideas for the book was this God character. And it was just a straight up, I used the words from the King James Bible, which I didn't do in this book because I wanted this book to be more Jewish and not Christian. But it was so much. I've always wanted to work with a really good writer and just illustrate. To do that in comics seems like utter freedom. There are a few books that I really love that are kind of old school comics that are collaborations. I love a lot of Alan Moore books and the people he's worked with. And I've always wanted to find a writer who I could just kind of jump off of and kind of make fun of and illustrate, but also make fun of, not just straight up illustrate. And I found that writer in the Bible. And so it seemed like a no-brainer to do the whole book of Genesis like that. But I realized really quickly that there is no writer of the Torah. There are many different voices in the Torah. So I had to keep changing my tactics for telling this story. And it felt like a pretty sophisticated thing that a pretty unsophisticated, I mean, the premise of this book is that I wanted to be unsophisticated and just pure emotion and pure fun. And I ended up having to be kind of a schemer after all. And I kept switching. I started out with this very round, fun style and this very round, fun character of God. And that character had to kind of dissolve and reinvent herself several times over the course of the book. And so did I.
I mean, it's like any great cover song. You've taken something and made it your own. But
Yeah.
that didn't happen. That wasn't necessarily what we set out to do.
Yeah.
And so you came to this project with your own history, sort of as a kid growing up in a Jewish household, and with your own feelings about your religious upbringing, but also you did a ton of research too. Even though you're going to say you didn't do a ton, but I know you did.
Know.
You read very widely to prepare for this book. So I'm wondering if you could just tell us, why don't we start with your own relationship to the Torah and a little bit about your upbringing and how that maybe inflected what you were doing here as well.
I will say I didn't do any research because I was not a lot of people I know are much more well-versed in the Torah than I am, and in the commentary and in biblical Hebrew and in everything. And I knew from the very beginning that I couldn't compete. I was kind of a lackluster Hebrew day school student who just Hebrew day school is kind of not super religious, not religious, but very immersed in the culture of Judaism and in the stories. And it's hard for me to explain how I felt about Judaism because I've never heard someone talk about this. I've heard a lot of people be really into religion, and I've heard a lot of people be really angry at religion. And I was just like, I was like made of oil, and religion was water, and it just never touched me. And I just always really loved the stories and the characters and felt no desire whatsoever to practice, and also no desire whatsoever to rebel. And so I just grew up with stories of God as if it were the Odyssey or just some lovely old text to enjoy and make fun of. And that's how I feel about God. And I still love her. I can't say him after working on this.
Well, we'll get to that in a minute. But tell us a little bit about what you, even though it's not a work of scholarship, right? You did
Yeah.
do a lot of reading, and can you talk a little bit about what you read in order to sort of get your mind in the place where you could take this on?
I kind of consciously did not dive into scholarship. I didn't read the commentators I knew I should read, such as even Rashi, who's the main Jewish guy, Jewish commentator. But I did go back to the Torah and I read it. I read the book of Genesis in Hebrew, which I feel very grateful to be able to do because of my education, although not that well. I kind of like flip back and forth Hebrew English, and I read the King James translation, which is gorgeous. I still love it. It's so beautiful and has something in common with just reading it in Hebrew because it feels ancient in its own way, although a different ancient. And finally, as I was working, I listened on tape to the book of Genesis translated by I want to say Robert Alter, although sometimes adrenaline makes me get people's names wrong. So I hope this is his name. I love his translation. I also read the Odyssey, and Athena really affected how I thought of this God character. There were some other things that went in there. I've always really, really loved a book by Rilke called Stories of God. It's this little kind of irreverent, poetic book of stories about God as if God is a person. And I actually did not reread that because I was afraid I would feel like I was copying it, which I probably am. I haven't read it in 15 years.
You read so widely. I always find that so inspiring, and it's such a I think you've always been a great writer, a writer of prose, but I think in this newest book, I think your writing has sort of reached a new level, and I'm wondering, sort of a process question here. How daunting was it for you to take on the book of Genesis and try to remake it in a way that felt truer to you?
It felt really good. I felt like I was sticking it to a lot of people, including our Crumb, but who I love in general, just not that book. I don't love his Bible, but
And why is that? Because it's too true to the text.
true. Yeah, it's
right.
too humorless. I think of the Bible as like really funny and weird and not something to worship. I just can't imagine it being something. I can't imagine God being a father figure. I don't know.
Right. Well, so your decision to portray God as a woman is, as we mentioned, was something that had appeared in Passing for Human, but really is sort of the driving force for Let There Be Light, from page 1.
She's a self-portrait. I think women, I have a really big ego, and I think it's hard to like have that identity as a woman because we don't have too many role models who admit it. And I feel like this book is kind of a performance piece of me owning my big ego and then being punished for it, or punishing myself for it with a lot of doubt.
That's funny. I never thought of it that way.
Yeah. I want to ask you what it was like to work as an editor on this.
I mean, I think, we had gotten into this. And in my mind, I sort of imagined it as being a more faithful retelling with some of your imbued by your imagination, but still staying somewhat true to the original text. And what we ended up with begins that way in a sense, although with a female God, and the world is very different. And so particular to your own vision, I just love. But then it becomes, as you move through it, something so different. Every story is not retold but reimagined.
It feels really true to the text to me, just with a lot cut out. Because when I envisioned making this book, I forgot that the Torah gets more and more long-winded as you go on, and it was just too much for a comic, for me
Right.
at least.
We didn't include everything.
Yeah,
right?
we
But
cut a lot out.
But there are stories that are set in New Jersey. There are stories that are set in the future. There are stories that are, where the characters are mermen.
Oh
And
yeah,
so like that's
I
what I
guess
mean.
that's
That's
true.
what I mean by reimagining rather than retelling, right? This is the essential truth, I think, is
Yeah,
not all that different, but the way that you've imagined these stories is wholly different in some cases, and thrilling in that way too, I think. And I wondered, if you thought about this as you were doing it, or even now that you finished it, to look back, like what you as a kid in Jewish school would have thought of this rendition of the Book of Genesis and how that would have affected you.
I think I wish I'd had myself as a kid as critic. I think you were the perfect editor for this, in that you gave me a George Saunders book on writing to read when I was very close to deadline, and I went and rewrote. Sorry, oh my gosh. You all have COVID now. I went and rewrote everything. And you were keeping me on the path of trying to be entertaining and connect to the audience, and it was easy for me to lose that path. I'm sorry.
You right?
I don't know.
You
I
right?
think so. Yeah, I'll try and mute next time.
No, it's fine. Take your time.
Yeah, you were having me keep my reader in mind in this really kind way, whereas I often think of my readers as people who are giving me a test that I have to pass. It's not very joyful. I don't think of them as people I want to entertain and connect with. And now I've lost
Okay.
them all.
You want to
Yeah.
have a little more water? Have a little more water.
It's not COVID, as far as I know. It's a cold. Yeah, so
Okay. Better.
I think so.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of for people in the audience here, it's a part of working with Liana is so amazing because, your imagination is so vast, and sometimes there are a million ideas and a million things that you're doing at once, and which is why your work is so special. But sometimes for something like this, it's always like we have to sort of find the cleanest line to the story, right?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
right.
Yeah,
So,
that's a way to be fast. Also, it's hard for me to be fast on a macro scale. That's why I'm more comfortable with really short things than longer things.
right.
And I think the reason I couldn't tell the whole book of Genesis is that it was getting repetitive. I only have so many jokes in me. And I was just like, if I make a 1,500 page book, the jokes are going to repeat themselves too much, especially in Abraham.
Abraham, the first draft of Abraham was like 200 pages long, right?
Took years. Yeah.
Right. But part of that was also you figuring out or getting comfortable with the fact that you could leave things out, right? That we didn't have to try to account for every storytelling beat that's in the original text, right?
Yeah. Abraham really, to me, feels like its own epic. It reminds me of what's that, the Irish, the Celtic one. I don't know, it reminds me of some book about a heroic man who has lots and lots and lots of adventures.
They just keep going and going and going and
Yeah.
going.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so how many of those adventures do we need to account for in the book?
Yeah, it's a lot.
Right.
But he also reminded me of my grandpa, just like a very decent man who's interested in real estate.
Right. Did you have a favorite chapter?
I think I love Abraham because it was the biggest challenge, I think. And I also love the first part, the creation part, because it came naturally. And I think like objectively, that's my favorite one. But I feel really good about Abraham because I feel like it was a problem that I wasn't necessarily for me, but I went and solved it anyway.
Right.
It wasn't a story that was handed to me on a plate. It was a story I had to turn into a puzzle and solve.
Right.
And I love the little interlude about withdrawal or symptom, because that just was like a gift to me. I think my mom told me about this. Like I showed her some pages of the book and she said, you're describing a Kabbalistic concept called symptom. And so I didn't have to do this is why I didn't do much research. People were giving me things.
Right. I mean, I want to get to that part of the book in a second, but I think, when coming back to what you said about creation being, sort of your favorite, maybe your favorite part of the book, or Abraham's your favorite, but for reasons that are more like from a personal challenge standpoint. The creation, that part of this book is stunning, and the animals are so beautiful, and Eve eating the apple is like one of the most kind of, I'll show people that page here, but it's just, I think, so inspired. And I remember when we were working on this book, here's that page here, if everybody can see it, which I just love. But I remember saying, I want more God. God is such a great character.
I did too.
Yeah. And we get so much of her in the beginning and then not as much at the end. So I want to like make sure that she's threaded through the book in a way that's going to be satisfying for people. And ultimately, you decided we couldn't quite do that because why?
Because God really does disappear in the Torah. Like God is this, and I think this is more of the Arkram God. Like you don't see this God, you just see men worshiping this God and following this God and hoping to meet this God, and they never do. It's all about the men. It's not about God.
Right, and it becomes just an idea.
Yeah.
Right, and so instead of God just sort of withdrawing from the story and disappearing from the pages and becoming more just of an idea for our characters to think about and talk about, you decided to account for that absence in a way in this book that I think is probably my favorite part of this book. And I'm wondering, is it possible for you to show people
what
that looks like and for you to read it to them? Because I think it's one of the more beautiful things that you've written.
Let's see if I have the Zoom skills. Okay. First, I'll pull it up and then I'll click share screen and then you'll tell me if you see it.
Okay.
Pull it up. Share screen. Oh, okay. Sorry.
We can see, I can see it. I hope everybody else can see that.
Okay. Ready? Withdrawal. Which
So this comes about 130 pages into the book, right? Where this is the moment where God begins to disappear from our story a bit.
Yeah, the book is divided into thirds and I call them past, present, and future because they correlate to bits of the Torah that I believe were written at very different times, actually. And in between the sections, I put these little mini sections, and this is the first one, withdrawal. In the beginning, God had been everywhere. In order to create the world, she first had to hollow out a space inside herself. Into this space, she put the world. This Kabbalistic theory, this is an aside, is called Tzimtzum. As the world grew, she withdrew herself more and more. She withdrew to the point that she was nearly imperceptible to her own creations. She would have become completely imperceptible if, in her wisdom, God hadn't left us a map to herself in the form of a collection of stories. If you look close enough at a droplet of water, you will see the entire universe inside of it. Just so with the Torah, as in life, God appears less in each chapter of the Torah than in the one before. In Abraham, she appears mostly as a disembodied voice. In Isaac, she is hinted at but not seen. And by Joseph, she is glimpsed only in dreams. God's vanishing is so gradual that we hardly notice it at all. She is letting us adjust bit by bit to the dark. And this page took me a very long time. For only in God's absence can we begin to comprehend her love for us. Only then can we see her in ourselves. That's the baby bird flying. And I think that is the end.
That's it. But I think,
Mm.
I hope for people listening that it's, I know it's hard when you're just sort of reading through it quickly, but it's just so beautiful. And I know that was one of that came very late in the process, I think, for you to sort of arrive at that realization, and then to put words to it, and to put it to the imagery with it is so beautiful too. And I feel like that in some ways makes the book.
Yeah.
And can you talk a little about how that all came to be? And
I think it came out of a conversation with you where I think you said, like, you've written the Torah, the Bible wrong. God, it's about God. God should be there. And I said, no, it's written wrong. God should be there, but God isn't there. And I'm just being a faithful interpreter, but I hate this book. And then, and you were like, you can't give readers a book that you don't like. And so I think I asked my mom what I should do. And I think she said, what you're describing is the Kabbalistic theory of Tzimtzum. So my mom and I both have very complicated relationships with Kabbalah. I find it really sexist and kind of icky. But I also haven't read enough of it. And I'm also very drawn to it the way I'm drawn to Kafka and Rilke and the fun writers like that. So Tzimtzum's kind of Tzimtzum, Kabbalah is kind of, I can't even tell you what Kabbalah is, just Google it. I'm so embarrassed that I'll get something wrong. I think it's, where did it originate? It's like a school of commentary of the Torah that was these kind of very spiritual rabbis. It feels kind of cultish to me, and it's very like, it's kind of fun and kind of dangerous. But I consider myself like a very like not non-fun. If I were more religious, I'd be one of the non-fun Jews. I'd be a Miss Nagid.
Do you feel like writing this book, did writing this book bring you closer to your faith?
It brought me closer to God. I feel like God wouldn't be that religious. Like, I love this character. I don't pray to her, but I talk to her.
Right. Can we talk a little bit about the visual language of this book too?
Yeah.
And the way that all happened, because as you mentioned, the book is divided into 3 different sections: past, present, and future. And each one of those sections actually has its own look, right? Its own style. And that was a conscious decision on your part. And you tried many different styles out, right? And I'm wondering, maybe if you want to share screen again to show people sort of what those 3 styles look like, but also maybe talk a little bit about why you felt that each one was appropriate for that part of the story, and what you were trying to convey through like very different, I think, very different styles in one book, right? And it starts out what I think is most people probably in a style that most people feel is more recognizably you,
Yeah.
and then we
Yeah.
get into some stuff later on that becomes quite different and I don't know, more expressive and um, and like ethereal, maybe. I don't know. I'm searching for words here, but it's a different look, and I feel like it's capturing something about the story that is really important to you.
Yeah. I earlier in my career as a cartoonist, or a comics artist, I switched styles a lot. My first book is called A Bintel Brief, and it's based on a series of letters written into an advice column, and I illustrated each letter in a slightly different style. And objectively, I think someone might say, why are all the styles kind of similar? They're not like wildly different. It's not really a shtick. And the answer is that I was trying to find my own style. And I think I started to find my own style after I wrote that book when I was in my late 20s. And I liked my style. I was kind of conscious about figuring it out. I consciously chose some role models who sometimes I feel like I copied too much. Shout out Brian Ray. I love his illustrations so much. And if I were doing it again, I might try a little harder not to copy too closely. And and I did pass. So the style I made works better for me for really small things. In comics, you have to draw the same characters over and over, and that doesn't come naturally to me, pedantic as I am. I'm not really pedantic as a drawer. And when I wrote Passing for Human, which was my memoir with the first book with the God character in it that I worked on with you, one of the things I set out to do as a challenge for myself was to find a style for comics. And it took me a long time. And it is kind of my adaptation of the style I made for cartooning. I use this one thin gel pen. The boxes are always squares. It's a grid of squares. I don't use a ruler. I map out a grid of dots and I freehand draw the lines, and the blacks are always in Passing for Human. The blacks were shaded in with the same pen. I never used a larger pen. I never used fill. So that was the style that I decided was my style, and especially for that book. And I set out to use that style for this whole book too. And it worked more or less for the first third, although I didn't do the shading in as much because I think it was giving me carpal tunnel and it didn't seem worth it. And then when I hit the story of Abraham, I realized that I'm not describing this character of God anymore, who is the kind of person who works with that style. Like, she grew out of that style. I'm trying to describe another character, and this character is more traditional and male and kind of weirdly, I don't think of God as someone who wants to be worshipped, but I do think of Abraham as someone who wants to be worshipped. He just strikes me that way. He reminds me of Philip Roth or John Updike or Pablo Picasso, just like all the towering male artist figures I grew up with. And so I decided to use this kind of art school style for him. I'll share screen with him. Share. Sorry, close your eyes while I scroll. Oh, actually, it's right here. Okay. I used something called a Blackwing pencil, which is a very expensive pencil. It comes with a replaceable eraser. And it's very dark and I like it. And I used a different paper than I usually use. I used a rougher drawing paper. But I work the same way I always work. That eraser doesn't erase fully. So instead of using the eraser, I just traced over and over and over. And I edit by tracing. I just do a million copies of each drawing, slowly editing as I go.
Talk to us a little bit about why you're making these decisions too. Why you're going for this kind of look for Abraham, and what you feel that it helped you capture in the story.
This look reminds me of the way it's kind of like a quote of the way I would have drawn in art school. It's a more traditional, like academy way of drawing. And I presented Abraham as a fine artist who went to art school. And I think of him as kind of the academy kind of character. And it's more, ancient text has this like cartoonish feel to me, especially the Torah. Like Hebrew is so, especially biblical Hebrew is so brief, like especially the early part of the Torah, there are so few words and they say so much. And Abraham gets more flowery and longer, and it reads to me more like English or more like something that's less ancient. And the way I translated it into a style was to translate it into my quote of, let's say, like a Domier, who's the lovely cartoon, just like some lyrical draftsman, but a draftsman nonetheless. Not not a super simple cartoonist. So I felt like I got Abraham's essence in the style, or my Abraham.
You want to take us to the third part and talk about the style that you chose for that, for maybe Joseph? You want to look at the Joseph?
I think I'm also proud of the ballpoint. I did the withdrawal part in ballpoint, and my husband Scott says it looks punk, and I think that's what I was going for, like a zine. Okay, close your eyes while I scroll. I'm sorry. This is the last part. This is the part that's called Future. And I did this with a really thin line. I think the most important thing about this part is that I did it all digitally. I felt like drawing digitally was futuristic. I wish I also really rushed this part. I really dove in, and I think I got the story how I wanted it. But I didn't have time to obsess over each page. So I still don't know what the most futuristic style could have looked like. But this was, in a way, I was blessed with having a tight deadline. And I don't think going into it would have made it any better. I used these fake Ben-Day dots that are just a Photoshop filter and this very thin line. I was using an iPad.
There was a version of this too that was full of robots.
Yes.
Right.
The red is much nicer in the book than on my PDF, but I took the robots out at the last minute. They didn't sit right with me. I don't know. I guess it's kind of clear why they wouldn't. It's random. I guess you know what? I was just trying to, I'll unshare. I was trying to explain something that was troubling for me. Like a lot of the parts of the book that we edited out were the parts that I just couldn't explain. Like the story of Hagar, she's treated so horribly that you just want to you want the rest of the Torah to be sympathizing with her instead of just this brief like throwaway fun story about this like enslaved woman who's kicked to the side of the road with her baby and treated as lesser. And like the Torah doesn't seem to feel that it feels bad for her, but not as bad as we would now. So that like I cut off the stories that I couldn't finish wrestling with that were just too hard. And I think the robot was my way of wrestling with how to tell the story of Jacob having two wives who are both sisters with each other and treating that as totally like a little annoying, but pretty normal.
It was like trying to figure out how to represent an idol, right? Remember that?
Yeah. I ended up making Leah into an idol
Yeah,
instead of a robot.
right.
So I
Yeah.
merged the second wife with problem with the idol problem. I don't
Yeah.
think idols are a problem. I get it. I get worshiping. I get worshiping a thing, a beautiful thing, so much more than I get worshiping God, our God, my God.
Do you think, I mean, do you think of, your work for the New Yorker has a very specific look and rhythm to it, and then the work that you do on Instagram, which a lot of us, follow religiously and love, has a very, very specific look. And then, each of your books, I think, is got its own sort of unique um, look to it. And I'm wondering, like, is that sort of like a writer working in different modes? Do you find, is that a way for you to, I don't know, grow as an author, as an artist? Do you feel like in some ways you're still searching for your style, or who you really are as a cartoonist and a writer? Or tell us a little bit about sort of what you're after there, and what those different modes sort of mean to you.
I think the difference for me between the New Yorker cartoons and what I post on Instagram is that New Yorker cartoons are 2 beats with the setup and a punchline.
Mhm.
And what I post on Instagram are more just like 1 beat observations often. And I'm not sure why they work. They're very fun to make. They're very, to me, very simple. And I don't know if I would enjoy them if I weren't making them. The books I think I feel comfortable working in the same style for all my New Yorker cartoons. Like I have one voice for my New Yorker cartoons, and I feel comfortable working in one voice for all my Instagram cartoons. A book is so much more complicated than a cartoon that I don't think I could work in the same voice for each of my books. I think each book needs its own voice, and you need to kind of make a voice in order to write a book.
And by voice here, do you mean
Style,
just
pacing.
your, yep, and also a visual voice as well, the visual as well as the written.
Yeah,
Right.
yes. And I really admire comics artists who are totally consistent and always work in the same voice. I think telling stories is the greatest joy, and coming up with a new visual language to me is not a great joy. And I feel like I spend so much more time figuring out the math and how to do it than I do actually doing it.
Right. Well, one of these days we're going to get you to write a book without any images in it at all, because you're an amazing writer of prose in your own right. And I think it's interesting to think about people who influenced your work as well. And for this book in particular, we talked about Crumb, right? But were there other people who that you drew inspiration from when you were writing this?
There must be. I'm thinking. Um, my f- I I I have a very few favorite artists in this realm. I love Roz Chast. I love Myra Kelman. I love. You know what? I think that I was drawing a lot from kids' books in this. Now that I think about it, those were my first, and I love them so much. They're poetry, especially in the first chapter.
Which ones?
Um, I love right now I'm really into Goodnight Moon and Miss Rumphius, but the ones that I would have said were my favorites are Maurice Sendak, William Steig. There's one Roz Chast book that I like love and read over and over. It's her collaboration with Steve Martin. It's an alphabet book. I love most of Myra Kelman's kids' books. They're wild and brilliant. I love Mark Allen Stamity's book, Who Needs Donuts? And there are more.
I think the creation part of this book really does have sort of a, I can see that now when you say it. I don't think I ever knew that, but I can
Yeah, I
can
didn't
see
either.
now.
Yeah, it's been really fun. I've been reading a lot of kids' books this year,
Right.
at
Stuff
least
like
the
that.
first few pages of each one.
Yeah. I love like stuff like this too.
Yeah, that's more Crumb or
Yeah, it's
Art
great.
Spiegelman.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never mention Art Spiegelman as like the main influence, but because he's just so clearly is for all of us, but he is. I will mention it because it needs mentioning right now.
um, yeah, I think there are a couple of questions from our in the Q&A that I want to get to here. Make sure that we answer the questions from the audience. But quickly here, before we do that, Liana, because you're one of the best read people that I've ever known.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, you are. What's on your nightstand right now? What are you reading?
But it's been sitting there. It's been sitting there for a month or two. My secret is that I read mostly on audio.
I can't read that. What is that? I can't see
Oh,
the.
it's called The Shiatsung Project by Brigitte Archambault.
Oh,
It is, I think it's Canadian, maybe it is French or Belgian.
I love the cover.
I do too. It's fun. I like the style. It's pretty graphic. I'm not going to show you any. Sorry.
Let's get to a couple questions from the panelists too. See one here that said, a question for you, Liana. Did you find the New Testament intimidating at all? How do you decide what to keep in each original story? Is it entirely dependent on your personal interpretation? Also, will you be translating any more ancient texts into comics in the future?
I'm so sorry. I just lost. Oh, got you. I was trying to read the comment. Not the new. I do find the New Testament intimidating, and I've never read it. Actually read it once, but this was the Old Testament.
Yep.
Do I find it intimidating? No. I grew up learning it in school. I was not a reverent child, and I hold the irreverence I felt as a child learning this. I do feel intimidated by synagogue. It feels almost too holy to touch, which might just be me protecting myself from being bored. I'm still not sure.
How about, there's a question here that says, to this non-artist, it appears that you draw in several different styles. Do you consider one of them to be your own or home or natural style?
Yeah, I do consider the first chapter to be my own style, although I taught it to myself in my late 20s. So a style really is created. I don't think you're born with a style. And now that I've worked in this Abraham style so much, I consider that to be my style as well. I think it takes, I don't know, about 10,000 hours, but I just saw that my husband asked if I wanted him to get me some water. Yeah, yes. But not anymore.
Too late.
Yeah, I feel like once you've put a number of hours into a style, it's your style. I'm currently trying to teach myself how to do color, and I'm not a colorist, but I think I will be once I've put in a really long time into it.
Here's a question here about what our process / collaboration looks like. I think we could probably both speak to that. I mean, I think it's really interesting. I would say Liana shows early and often, right?
Yes.
And a lot of what I'm seeing early on, the drawings are very, very basic. They're just like, you're just like basically blocking things out with text. So nothing is finished or colored in or anything. It's all just sort of like very simple line drawings and sort of working out the beats of the story, right?
And you asked me to do that. Like I wouldn't have presumed, but I think you have a really good sense for how to keep a story natural and you knew that that would work for me, even though I don't think you've worked with a ton of
No,
comics.
I haven't, but
Yeah.
you know, but it's also like a story is a story, right? It
Yeah.
has to succeed. The same principles apply, whether I worked in magazines for a long time too, whether it's
Yeah.
a 7,000 word magazine story or a 120,000 word book or, you know, a graphic novel. It's still, a story has to succeed according to certain, you know, basic principles. So I feel like I can at least approach it that way. I don't know. I've learned a lot from you about the way that, you know, graphic works function. But the feedback that I can offer is the story making sense? Should we slow down here and do a little
Yeah.
more?
Yeah.
What can
You
we get
say
rid of?
that.
Yeah, what's essential? I can point out the things that I really love and ask for more of that. But um, you know, I think what happened on Passing for Human, I feel like we achieved a more efficient process here. Passing for
Yeah.
Human, so everybody here on this call knows, I think Liana rewrote and redrew that book probably like 15 times, and not just redrew it like in a basic way, redrew every panel like to the point of it being finished, and then redid the entire book again, right?
Yeah.
Which was, I mean, I so admire you have an incredible work ethic and an openness to rethinking things. But this time around, I think our system worked a little bit more efficiently and probably
Yeah.
saved you from having really bad carpal tunnel.
I think so.
Um,
That was my education.
I
I
mean,
feel like you read as you make sure that you read as a person rather than as like an editorial wonk, and you like you look for simplicity and feeling, and that's the best editor to have.
well, it's, you know, you are able to execute on things in a way that's really rare and amazing. There's a question in the chat here from Paul, who says, it's always a great question here. What's the takeaway for this book? What do you want readers to walk away with? What feeling, what idea? I love that question. I ask that question of writers all the time.
What feeling to take away from this?
Yeah.
Sorry, I was like
Yeah.
reading all the chats.
Yeah.
I think the feeling I want you to take away from the first part of the book is that God can be fun and doesn't have to be remote and doesn't have to be worshipped and doesn't have to be believed in, and the Bible doesn't have to be something you can't read if you're not religious. And also that if you do like God, you should feel free to recreate God in your own image or in any image you'd like. From the rest of the book, I think it's a little less pleasant, but I'd like you to take away the feeling that the Bible and maybe every old work of literature, maybe every work of literature is just unknowable and something you have to approach with total question mark.
There's another question here that I would love to touch on before we leave, which is, are you working on a next project? It sounds like this project was at least in part inspired from outside. How did that come about? We talked a little bit about that. Was it an editorial suggestion? Your publisher wanted a next book from you, and this is what you all hit upon. So not really. This did sort of spring from Passing for Human. And then a conversation between us of just sort of loosely saying, hey, what if we did like the Old Testament in graphic form? And then you went off and produced something like beyond my wildest dreams in that regard. But do you want to talk a little bit about what you're working on next?
Yeah, I'm working on I was working hard on pitches, but I haven't started. We just decided that I would do some more books for you, and I'm really, really happy and excited to get to start working again. One is going to be a book about motherhood, and it will have some of the Instagram drawings I've been doing in it and some other things, some longer things. And one is a kind of crusty book of etiquette, like not crusty etiquette, like etiquette from the point of view of a paranoid and crusty person, me, like how to stand in line, how to pass someone on a sidewalk, like how to eat, like how to wield a fork.
I think
and
we
things-
described it as a book for how to interact, a book for awkward people on how to interact with the world, right?
Yeah, like people to whom these things don't come naturally and to whom they matter a lot.
Right.
And I think if I do research, I'd like to read, oh man, like Greeks and the French guy. Okay, moving on. Who's the French guy? The essayist. Sorry, it's a French name
Which guy?
with an M. I have parent brain. Yeah, I have not read enough of his essays, but he was kind of the first personal essayist. I will do some research. And then the last book I care about a lot, and it's the hardest one to describe, and it will be like an immersive story experience. So I think it'll be the most fun one for me to write. It's kind of a love story between an angel and a devil, and it's about relationships.
Yeah, it's a
And it's
graphic
called
novel.
She Devil.
Graphic novel, right?
Yeah.
Should be. I think we have time for one more, and I think it's always a good one. Can you just tell us a little bit about how you got started and how you first got published in The New Yorker and
Yeah.
became who you are now?
So it's a kind of simple, kind of complicated story. I loved drawing as a kid. I didn't know a ton of other art people. So I didn't really know that what I was doing might be called cartooning. I always said I wanted to be an artist. But once I went to art school, I realized that wasn't true. I realized I was a cartoonist. And there was a little bit of anguish trying to figure out how to do that. I got a Fulbright grant after college to make a graphic novel. I just kind of banged my head against the wall the whole time, but that was kind of an education, figuring out how to do the most basic parts of it. I started submitting to the New Yorker. It took a lot of years before I felt confident enough to do it regularly. You have to do it regularly. I got in at a really lucky moment. The New Yorker cartoon department was just suddenly starting to expand and kind of looking for new voices, and I was a new voice. So it was just it was an exciting moment. The first day I submitted, there was a documentary being made about the New Yorker. So I was on film, and it was fun and kind of shot through with like making friends with this documentary staff. And that's how I ended up at the New Yorker. And I finally, the first graphic novel I made was a Bintel brief. I applied for a grant after the first grant to get to do that. And that grant was called the 6 Points Fellowship. And they gave me a lot of like, just feeling of emotional support. And I think that's how I pulled through it and did it. How much changed since then?
A lot. And now, yeah, and many more books to come.
So I know.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's probably all the questions we have time for here. Car,
Hi.
thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you both so much to Liana and Andy. I'm so appreciative of your time, and what a really great conversation. Is it too gauche to say it was enlightening? Because it was.
We'll take that.
I so appreciated it. And I'm so appreciative to this really generous and engaged audience who joined us tonight with really great questions. I would be remiss if I didn't link to Liana's book just once more here, if we're able to. I hope I copy pasted the right link. Okay, and once again, I'm so appreciative of you all for joining us, and to you, Liana and Andy. This is really great, and Liana, congratulations.
Thanks, Car. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming.
Yeah. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Andy, so much.
Okay, take care. Thank you.
Montaigne.
Monday. Yeah, the chat was on it.
Oh, there we go. That's right.
Bye.
Thanks, y'all. Good night.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Bye. You too.
Bye.